How's everybody doing? Checking in here with another video. Today I want to talk about some bands that have certain names that are all from the same time period. And they all feature names of, well, animals. I know that's kind of a weird subject matter to do the video on, but I try to group the bands together into themes. I try to talk about several bands in each video and try to link them together, have them have something in common. I just think it makes the videos better to do it like that. So these bands didn't really have anything in common other than the fact that their band names have an animal in them. And I thought that was interesting. And obviously they're from the same time period. These are early 70s bands. A golden age of music. I mean, man, 1970 to 1975. Oh my God. Only 1990 to 1995 matches 1970 to 1975 in terms of the sheer amount of great stuff that was coming out. So these are bands that have an animal in their name. Now, the first one I've probably already talked about, but Atomic Rooster, probably the most famous of these bands that has an animal for a name here. Atomic Rooster, really cool band name, by the way. Sounds quite heavy metal. And this is their first album and their best album, called Death Walks Behind You. And they're from Britain, and they released this in 1970, right around the time Sabbath was releasing their stuff, like Paranoid. This was released in September of 1970. Their heaviest record by far. It's got a lot of doom stuff on it. I want to especially recommend the title track, Death Walks Behind You, the opening track. 7.5 minutes long, very doomy, dark, and just a spectacular song. It's got to be one of the best songs that came out in 1970. They're very progressive, but very proto-doom on this album. So check out Atomic Rooster's Death Walks Behind You. That's actually their second album, not their debut. I misspoke. It's their second album. And it's the second album of the same year. Ironically, they followed basically the exact same path that Black Sabbath did. They released one album in the winter of 1970, and then one album in the fall of 1970. So both Sabbath and Atomic Rooster from the same country, and released two albums at the same time frame of the same year. Very, very odd coincidence, and they happen to both be fairly doomy type of releases. But I want to talk about three other bands that are a little more under the radar type of bands than Atomic Rooster. I mean, you also have Camel, which is a very
Tuning into this presentation about 3 heavy proto bluesy hard rock bands from the early 70s that had animals for their names. Animal type bands. Let's start with the first one, the amphibian band Toad. Toad was from Switzerland, so they are a Swiss band. One of the first Swiss bands I've come across. And they were formed by Vic on lead guitar, and they had an ex-Brain Ticket member Werner Froelich on bass. And they released a very well-known album, at least for the underground scene. It was pretty famous. Self-titled Toad album in 1971 in April. This album has about 500,000 views on YouTube. Well deserved. And it's probably their best album and their heaviest album. It really does get into the Proto Stoner category and heavy psych category at times. Pretty bluesy, as is common with a band from the early 70s. They had Benjamin Yeager on vocals, and he has a pretty good bluesy voice for the music. They have a famous song, or at least a semi-famous single that was actually a charting single called Stay, and that actually, ironically, wasn't even released originally on the album. It was actually left off the album and just released as a single with Animals World, but it's one of their most famous tracks, and it was later added to the album on reissues in the 1990s. They included it as bonus track, so if you buy the CD or vinyl, you probably will get that track. But on the original release, the big hit Stay was left off. But the self-titled album is really, really good. It kicks off with Cottonwood Hill, a nice 8.5-minute stretch, a lot of great riffing by Vic in these songs. They have a lot of variance in this album, going from some 8.5-minute track in the opener to a 3.5-minute track and another 3.5-minute track. Then they go into the lengthier tracks again. And Life Goes On, track 5, is a 12-minute epic. And they do get kind of doomy on that track. Obviously, if it's 12 minutes long, doomy is kind of par for the course. But it's not pure doom. It goes into different directions, starting out kind of heavy and brooding, and then going into a softer section, then going back into the heavier section. A lot of great riffs and vocals on that song. Stretches out really well. They Say I'm Mad is about 7 minutes long, and it also has some great riffs in it. Track 6, Pig's Walk, one of my favorites on the album. 7.5 minutes long. Very frantic, wah-drenched, psych-drenched guitar playing. Very intense guitar playing on that track. If you're into the groovy wah-drenched stuff and just some insane guitar soloing and stuff like that, Pig's Walk is really good. And it also even features a little drum solo towards the end that lasts about a minute. But just a lot of great guitar riffing packed into these songs. Some really great stuff. Tomorrow Blue is their second album. I actually haven't heard that album yet, but I've heard it's a bit more progressive, and I've also heard it's almost as good as the debut album. Very quality still. A little less heavy bluesy and more prog. A little less psychedelic and a lot more prog. It also has a couple long tracks, a 9-minute track and a 12-minute track. They released one more album in the 70s called Dreams, which I've heard it was a big step down and not very good at all. It is worth noting that the vocalist from the self-titled album, Benjamin, left the band right after the recording of the self-titled debut, so he was not featured on the second album, Tomorrow Blue. They actually had Vic, the guitar player, take over on vocals. Toad is a great band, definitely for those heavy bluesy, the fans that like that heavy blues, gritty heavy blues, early heavy psych. So check out Toad, especially their self-titled debut album. Band number 2 is called Fuzzy Duck. They are from London, so another British band formed in 1970. They only released one self-titled album in 1971, so a very short career. It says they were only active for 1 year between 1970 and 1971. It's a damn shame. Fuzzy Duck has had renewed interest in the previous decades here, and they've had some reissues of their one album. You can find their one album. It's on YouTube, and it's pretty damn good. Fairly lengthy, 40 minutes. It's got a lot of prog on it. They aren't like super heavy fuzz, like Fuzzy Duck. Like, I know a lot of people, when they find an album, an album that's called Fuzzy Duck, they think that it's gonna just be like Black Sabbath, fuzz-drenched stuff, like really heavy down-tuned stoner proto stuff like Sir Lord Baltimore, Buffalo, stuff like that. It's actually a lot more mellow, a lot more prog, a lot lighter, you know, more accessible sounding. But it does get heavy and good in certain parts of the album if you're into the heavier stoner stuff, especially on a song like Country Boy, track 6, which is probably the best song on the album. I also really love Afternoon Out. There's lots of great riff playing on this album. Just Look Around You has great guitar playing on it. The opening track, Time Will Be Your Doctor. Lots of Hammond organ also on this album. Boy, they're just really heavy on the Hammond organ. Just typical of the early 70s. Very groovy, very, very bluesy. They have a singer named Mick Hawksworth, or Doc, as he was nicknamed, and they've got Roy Charland on the organ, and also some backing vocals. He also plays electric piano. Paul Francis is the drummer, and it's a very, very good album. It's got some really interesting looking album artwork as well, with a duck on it, and he's got this hippie look to him. It's just a very interesting album. I've known the album for a long time. I've kind of forgotten about it over time because I never did get around to buying it, but it's a good album, and if you buy the CD, you'll get some bonus tracks. Looks like they tossed in 4 bonus tracks, and that stretches you out to a 50+ minute of music. So even though it's only one album, if you buy the CD, you do get a pretty lengthy 12 songs. So go check out Fuzzy Duck and their self-titled debut from 1971 for some Hammond-laden psychedelic rock. Definitely a cool band. Before I get into the last band, I wanted to mention, I just saw this. The Toad guitarist passed away. He just passed away November 1st from an undisclosed cause. So rest in peace to Vic, guitarist of Toad. Band number 3, we finally have reached the trifecta here with Incredible Hog, another London-based band. That's the second London-based band. They were a 3-piece. They were formed from the product of the 60s British blues boom, so they had a hard and intelligent, meaningful lyrics, and they were formed by their guitarist and vocalist Ken Gordon and their bassist Jim Holmes, and they'd actually played at school together in a band called Speed Auction. And they formed Incredible Hog in early 1972, and they took their name out of the Incredible Hulk comic book series. So instead of Incredible Hawk, it was Incredible Hog. So that's the that's the history behind the interesting band name. Incredible Hog definitely catches your attention when you see that. And they had some problems getting gigs, but they finally did start getting gigs. They weren't able to attract the attention of a record company, but eventually they did get picked up by Dart Records. And interestingly, the guitarist Ken Gordon, he marched into the offices and refused to leave until someone had listened to their demo tape. And then he had actually been threatened with ejection by the police. But eventually the persistence had paid off, and they were signed by Dart Records. So very interesting, but just goes to show that don't take no for an answer. Sometimes you gotta take life by the horns and really get what you want by persistence. And that's what these guys did. But they didn't have a very long career. They released only one album in the early 70s called Volume 1, and they then folded in 1973. They just didn't have enough record label support, and so they just weren't able to stick around. But they have been picked up, released their old album and remastered it and everything, so you can still find the Incredible Hog album out there today. The Incredible Hog album is definitely a great album, especially Another Time and the opening track Lame, as well as Tadpole and Warning. These are some really great songs. Wreck My Soul, the second track, is the longest track on the album at 5.5 minutes. Really great guitar licks on it. Great guitar playing, as is always the case with these early 70s bands. If you like riffs, they always have it in spades. You like organ, they have it in spades. Just some really good stuff. The artwork is, I gotta say, absolutely hideous looking. It's just, you gotta see the album artwork. It's just, I'll include it in the video here. It's nuts. So, interesting to say the least. So check out Incredible Hog, check out Toad, and check out Fuzzy Duck. I hope you found some interesting new bands that you haven't heard yet. Thank you for listening and taking the time, and doom on, guys.